Do you struggle with how to deal with criticism, how to respond, what to take in, what not to take in? And really, we all hate criticism. I can't think of anyone I know who likes criticism, but learning how to deal with it, learning how to respond, being able to analyze the criticism you receive, all of that is really helpful. So today I'm going to cover how to respond in the moment, because I know that's really hard for a lot of us. And then I'm going to address how to think about the criticism, how to know whether it was constructive or destructive, how to know how you feel about it. And then the third section of today's video is going to be how to respond. So let's start with in the moment. The most important thing to do in the moment when you are receiving the criticism is to try to stay emotionally regulated. Try to not let your fight, flight, freeze response take over. So one of my favorite tools for that is diaphragmatic breathing. And if you know you're going into a situation where you might be criticized or be receiving a critique, I think that sort of some self-soothing before you go into the situation could be really helpful. But doing what you can to stay grounded, emotionally regulated while you are receiving the criticism or feedback. Also, in the moment, always remember that criticism is an opinion. It's not a fact. If somebody is criticizing you, you are hearing their opinion. So keep that in mind. Try to be curious about what they're saying and what you're hearing. Is there something you want to clarify? Are you curious why they hold that opinion? Often in the moment, if you can really pull your curiosity out, even if your curiosity is sort of like, why is this person giving me this criticism? That curiosity can be very protective. It can help you emotionally regulate, and you might actually get some useful information. And even if you don't feel curious, you can act curious. You can pretend to be curious, particularly if it is a situation where you are receiving the feedback for a reason, say a job review. Next tip with regard to a response in the moment, try not to be defensive. Now, this is really hard for most of us, but if there is something you need to defend yourself about, you will have time later, and it will come across better when you are more emotionally regulated. So using that emotional regulation will help you not be defensive. Not being defensive will help you stay emotionally regulated. And also using that curiosity is going to help you not be defensive. And then try not to counterattack. For example, if you receive criticism from a friend who complains that you're always late, for you to jump in and be like, well, you're just too rigid, is really not going to move the conversation in a productive way, right? So not counterattacking in the moment. And the more you feel attacked by the criticism, the more you're going to feel like attacking, right? So this is going to come into the next section that I'm going to talk about, which is analyzing the criticism. Because if you're receiving destructive criticism, it's very hard not to feel attacked, which is going to make you want to attack. But to be honest, attacking back when you're attacked with destructive criticism rarely gets you anywhere and rarely makes you feel better. So again, I think it's a good guideline. In the moment, try not to counterattack. Okay, let's go to the second part of this. So usually when we receive criticism or a critique or feedback, we do have time to reflect on it. And it's definitely worth taking that time. And the first thing to reflect on is whether the criticism was constructively delivered or destructively delivered. And I did a whole video, I probably posted it 2 weeks ago, but I'm going to show the slide here because I go through the components of constructive criticism and then the components of destructive criticism. So with constructive criticism, it's specific to the situation. Destructive is usually very general. The second thing about constructive criticism to keep in mind is that there's something you can do about it. There is a change you could make if you wanted to, right? Whereas with destructive criticism, it's very often there's nothing you can do about it. Number 3 of constructive criticism is that the person who is criticizing you kind of has the right to criticize you, or it is appropriate to the relationship. So yes, your boss has the right to give you a critique. A coworker? Maybe not. And sometimes we give the right to somebody to give us feedback or a comment or critique, right? Which is criticism. We might say to a friend, "Do you like this outfit on me?" So then if they comment back, we've given them the right to comment on our outfit. But if a total stranger approaches us on the street and gives us their opinion on our outfit, okay, but that person has no relationship to me. So with constructive criticism, the person somehow has the right to give you their opinion on the specific issue. And then the number 4 thing with constructive criticism, which is really important, and I think a lot of people miss, the agenda is clear. If this is your boss at work, the agenda is pretty clear. You want to keep your job, you want to do a good job, and they want you to do a good job, and they want you to do a better job in these areas. So they have the right to say it. If they're giving you a specific criticism with something you can do about it, and your agenda is to try to learn exactly what it is they would like changed and see if you can do it, right? So the agenda is clear. With destructive criticism, right, often it's general. Often there's nothing you can do about it. Sometimes it might be relevant to the relationship or not, because definitely a boss can give somebody very destructive criticism. A spouse can give their partner very destructive criticism, but you also sometimes get destructive criticism from people who, you have no relationship with, or it's not appropriate to that relationship. An example of an agenda not being clear in, say, a spousal relationship, if one person is always criticizing the other one for being too messy, there might be a hidden message underneath that criticism. It might really be a feeling of you don't support me, you don't value my time, you don't consider me. There's something underneath it that isn't being said. And then the other part of the agenda could be that you have differences in opinion in terms of how clean your home needs to be, right? So the agenda is not clear if the criticism is delivered in a destructive way. If it can be flipped and it can be turned into something constructive, so it's like, okay, we both want a peaceful household. How do we achieve that given that we have different views of cleanliness, right? So finding that shared agenda, we're going to come back to that. And then a big problem with destructive criticism is that it almost always uses you statements, labeling of the other person. You're so selfish. You are irresponsible. You're mean. It's sort of a broad, not specific, right? General condemnation of you as a person. So as you reflect on the criticism you've received, you can put it in the category of constructive or destructive. Or you might even say parts of it were constructive, but parts of it were destructive. So make your analysis, right? And then I'm going to give you some things to reflect on if it was destructive and some things to reflect on if it was constructive. So if it's destructive criticism, know that it is more about the other person's mood than about you. It's more about their frustration, anger, maybe some underlying feelings that they don't want to admit. But the destructive criticism is often an attack, and there's not always that much you can do to respond to destructive criticism, because if you respond with defensiveness or you respond with a counterattack, it usually doesn't go well. So I think something to think about if you're receiving destructive criticism from somebody is whether the relationship is worth the effort to go under what it is they're saying to try to find out what the real problem is, right? So if you receive destructive criticism from a boss and it's a job you love, you don't want to leave your job, right? And you can be the more emotionally mature person in the relationship, can you find out what the real problem is? Can you use that curiosity and really think through what it's really about? Because if your boss is overly stressed and has too big of a burden on them and they're just spewing it out on you, then you can be clear that this is really not about you. And again, while nobody should have to deal with that and nobody should have to be on the receiving end of that, if you want to try to shift the conversation, see if you can shift it towards problem solving. See if you can go back and say, look, I can see how much pressure is on you, right? starting with some kind of connection to the person or understanding what they're dealing with can be very helpful. I can see how much pressure there is on you, and I do want to help. But for me to make some changes, I might need to know more specifics, or I might need more support in these other areas, or maybe we can find a more efficient way to do this, right? Shifting it to problem solving, again, if the relationship is worth it. And if not, if you're just on the receiving end of destructive criticism and you can't at the moment get away from it, responses like, thank you for your feedback, perfectly fine. Don't really have to say anything else, right? And that topic is probably worth at least 2 or 3 videos because it's very complicated how to respond to destructive criticism. So drop a comment below if you want me to go into that topic more. Okay, so let's say the criticism you received is mostly constructive. Now, if you had a huge emotional response to the criticism, despite the fact that it was delivered in a constructive way and had constructive content, it probably hit some kind of trigger button, right? Some kind of sore spot in you. When we have oversized reactions to things, it very often hits a wound, right? Probably from childhood. Could be sort of a trauma response where we respond to something as if it's this upsetting, when in reality it's like this upsetting. Like, sure, okay, maybe this would upset anybody a little bit, but I can tell I'm having way too big a response here. That means it's hit a wound. So in the long term, healing that wound is going to be super helpful. And in general, when something hits a trigger spot like that and hits an internal wound, it is hitting our negative core belief. It's hitting a negative belief that we have about ourselves anyway, or it's somehow triggering that belief, and that's why it's so upsetting to us. So there are many ways to work on this. With regard to therapy, as a therapist, I found EMDR therapy, and I'll put the words here on the screen, and I do have a number of videos on EMDR therapy. I don't do it one-on-one with people anymore, but it is a very effective technique for healing some of those childhood wounds and healing those negative core beliefs. And then I also want to share with you that I do have a free PDF, Transform Your Negative Core Belief. It helps you walk through to identify exactly what that core belief is, and then gives you 3 techniques to rewire it, right? To begin to develop a more adaptive, positive belief. So many people have found that super helpful. The link will be in the notes to this video. So in general, just knowing that if you are having an oversized reaction to criticism that was constructively delivered, it's probably hit that sore spot. So try to self-soothe, try to separate the issues in your mind, come back to the present moment and what you need to do about the criticism today. Okay, so that's sort of the biggest topic here. But here's some other pointers. If you've received constructive criticism, I want to ask you, do you agree? Remember that criticism is an opinion. Do you agree with this opinion or not? You get to use your own critical thinking about whether or not it's valid, right? And then another question is, do you need more info? Do you need more info to know whether it's valid or what you should do about it? Often when we receive feedback from somebody else or a criticism from somebody else that we would like to address, in the moment, we often can't really ask enough questions. So sometimes you do need to go back and ask some clarifying information. And then think through, is it worth it to you to make this change? So a criticism is almost always a veiled request, right? It's a request by the other person for you to do something differently. Again, if it's constructive, right? Because if it's destructive, then it's just about you're a horrible person, right? But if it's constructive, there's a veiled request for something to be different. Is it worth it to you to make that change? Are you capable of making that change? Okay, so all of that is sort of the thinking that goes into how you respond to the criticism. And I can hear people saying, I don't have time to do that. And no, we wouldn't have time to go through this whole process with every criticism we receive, because there's a lot of criticism out there. We all receive a lot. We probably give a lot. We're probably more aware of what we receive than what we give, right? But there is a lot. but I'm talking about sort of the major issues in our life, the major areas where we receive feedback that is worth thinking through and figuring out how to respond. So, last section, how do you respond? So I just want to say your internal response is the most important thing here. So having gone through that process and that analysis of the criticism and your feelings about it, that's going to help you be able to sort through the fact that the criticism is about a specific issue or behavior. It's not a condemnation of you as a person if it's constructive, right? And if it's destructive, even though the other person is trying to condemn you as a person, you don't have to take that in because that's more about them than you. So when you go back to the person to respond, my main suggestions are to keep the focus on problem solving and keep the focus on the shared agenda. What is the common agenda between you and this person? Meaning, what do you both want? What do you both want out of the relationship? So I'd like to empower you to understand that you have the right and the ability to assess the criticism you're receiving and to decide whether you want to accept it or not, whether you want to integrate it into your work and your personal relationships going forward or not. And I would love to hear from you. I am open to criticism. And actually, I might do a video using some of the criticism and comments I receive. I love my viewers. They give me great feedback. But when I receive that feedback, I do go through these questions, right? Is it relevant to the relationship, right? Is it relevant to the viewer being able to benefit from the information I'm providing? Anyway, I would love to hear your comments. Let me know if this was useful. If it was, hitting that like button is very helpful for me, as well as hitting the subscribe button to make sure you are shown additional videos from this channel. All right, take care, and I'll see you next week.